What would you do if saving a stranger cost you everything? Emma Sinclair, a compassionate nurse, risked her entire career to save a dying homeless man, only to lose her job, her future, and everything she had worked for. But what she didn't know was that the man she saved was no ordinary man. Years later, he returns, powerful, unrecognizable, and determined to change her life the way she changed his. This is a story of sacrifice, redemption, and love born from the most unexpected places. Where are you watching from? Comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Rain hammered the streets of London, turning the pavement into a glistening sheet of water. The city, usually alive with the hum of traffic and the murmur of late-night wanderers, now stood eerily silent. Only the distant wail of sirens and the occasional gust of wind disturbed the stillness. Emma Sinclair pulled her coat tighter around her, her breath visible in the freezing air as she hurried down the nearly empty sidewalk. Her shift at St. James Hospital had been brutal. 17 hours straight in the air, tending to victims of a bus crash, an elderly man who had collapsed in his kitchen, and a young girl whose fever refused to break. Her feet ached, her muscles screamed, but exhaustion was nothing new. It was part of the job. As she rounded a corner near a row of shuttered shops, movement caught her eye. Under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, a figure was hunched beneath an awning, motionless except for the slight tremor running through his body. Emma's steps slowed. London had its share of homeless souls, men and women who had slipped through the cracks, ignored by the world. But there was something different about this one. Even from a distance, she could see his body trembling violently, his soaked clothes clinging to him as if they were made of lead. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, his bare hands curled into fists against his knees, as though he were holding himself together through sheer will. Emma hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward. "Sir." Her voice was steady, calm, the same tone she used with distressed patients. The man barely stirred. She crouched beside him, pushing aside the damp strands of hair from his forehead. The moment her skin met his, alarm shot through her. He was burning up, a fever, and a bad one. His breathing was shallow, each inhale labored, his entire frame sagging as if he barely had the strength to sit upright. "You need help," she said, her pulse quickening. "Can you stand?" A raspy chuckle escaped him, though there was no humor in it. His eyelids fluttered open just enough for her to see the fever, bright haze clouding his eyes. "Don't." "Bear," he mumbled. His voice was raw, hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I'll be fine." "You won't." Emma pulled out her phone, quickly dialing emergency services. "I'm calling for an ambulance." He exhaled, slow and resigned, his body slumping further against the wall. He didn't argue, but he also didn't look hopeful. The rain intensified as she waited, her free hand pressing lightly against his shoulder to keep him steady. "What's your name?" she asked. No response. His eyelids drooped again, and for a terrifying second, she thought he might pass out completely. Then a low murmur. "Luke." "Okay, Luke. Stay awake for me, all right?" The distant wail of sirens finally cut through the night. Relief surged through her, but it was short-lived. When the ambulance pulled up, 2 paramedics stepped out, their bright yellow uniforms stark against the darkness. Emma stood quickly. "He has a dangerously high fever. He needs immediate treatment." The older paramedic, a graying man with sharp eyes, crouched beside Luke and did a quick assessment. His brow furrowed, no-eyed. Emma hesitated. I don't know. I didn't check." The younger paramedic, a woman in her late 30s, sighed. "We can't take him without identification or insurance." Emma's stomach dropped. He can't even hold himself up. You can't just leave him here? The male paramedic shook his head. Hospital policy. Unless he's coding or unconscious, we can't transport undocumented patients. The words hit her like a slap. So you're just going to let him die out here? A flicker of regret crossed the woman's face, but she didn't argue. I'm sorry. Emma turned back to Luke. His body had gone still, his breaths shallow and uneven. The ambulance doors shut, and within seconds, the vehicle disappeared down the street, leaving her alone with him once more. For a moment, she stood frozen. Then, something in her snapped. Fine. Fine. All right, Luke, she murmured, tightening her grip around his ice-cold hand. You don't trust me, but you don't have a choice. With strength she didn't know she had, she looped his arm over her shoulder, hoisting him up. He let out a weak groan, his legs barely cooperating. Just hold on, she whispered. And then, step by step, she dragged him toward the hospital. The back entrance to St. James Hospital loomed ahead, its harsh fluorescent light spilling onto the rain. Slick pavement. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she half-carried Luke through the door. He was dead weight in her arms, his fever-ridden body barely responding. The moment they crossed the threshold, the stark contrast between the warmth of the hospital and the cold bite of the London night hit her like a wave. She had done it. She had gotten him inside. Now she just had to keep him alive. No one noticed her at first. The night shift staff was scattered, some buried in paperwork, others tending to patients. Emma kept her head down, guiding Luke toward an empty examination room, her heart hammering in her chest. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster. If someone saw her before she could act, before she could get him stable, everything would be over. As soon as they reached the room, she eased him onto the hospital bed. He groaned, his head rolling to the side, his skin clammy and burning up beneath her touch. The sight of him like this, fragile, so close to slipping away, sent a rush of urgency through her veins. She had to move fast. She grabbed a thermometer from the bedside table and pressed it against his forehead. The number flashed a second later. 104.5 def, 20.3 defs. Too high way, too high. If it climbed much further, he'd be in serious danger of organ failure. Stay with me, Luke, she murmured, forcing steel into her voice. She reached for an ice pack from the small storage unit, pressing it against the back of his neck. His body barely reacted, his breathing shallow and unsteady. Emma clenched her jaw. She had treated dozens of patients in critical condition before, but this was different. This was different. This was personal. Moving swiftly, she reached for an IV kit, her fingers steady despite the storm raging inside her. She prepped his arm, inserted the needle with practiced precision, and attached a saline drip to rehydrate him. The slow drip of liquid into his veins was reassuring, but it wasn't enough. He needed antibiotics. Immediately. And that's where the real problem started. Hospital policy was clear. No medication without patient documentation. No ID, no treatment. And Luke had nothing. No name in the system, no records, nothing that would get him approved. Even if she brought his case to the attending physician, he'd be turned away. The same system that had just abandoned him on the street would do it again, without hesitation. Her stomach twisted. There was only one way around this. Emma sat at the small computer station in the room, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. This was career suicide. She wasn't just bending the rules. She was breaking them wide open. If anyone found out, she wouldn't just be fired. She could lose her medical license. Everything she had worked for, gone. But then she looked at Luke. his face gaunt, his body wrecked by fever. He wasn't just another patient. He was a man the world had thrown away, a man she had chosen to save. She exhaled sharply and began typing. New patient entry, Daniel Lewis. Age 34, diagnosis, severe bacterial infection. Immediate antibiotic treatment required. Her fingers trembled slightly as she printed the document, signing it with a name she wasn't supposed to use. She folded the paper and made her way toward the pharmacy window, her pulse hammering in her ears. The night shift pharmacist barely looked up as she slid the document across the counter. Antibiotics for a new admit, she said, her voice even, practiced. He skimmed the paper, nodded, and disappeared into the back. Emma forced herself to remain calm, her hands stilling at her sides. When he returned a minute later, he handed her a small vial of intravenous antibiotics. No questions, no second glances. It worked. Clutching the vial, she rushed back to the exam room, filling a syringe with the precise dosage. With a deep breath, she injected the medication into Luke's IV, watching as the clear liquid disappeared into his veins. Now all she could do was wait. The minutes stretched into hours. Emma refused to leave his side, her body aching from exhaustion, her mind racing with the weight of what she had done. If someone checked the system in the morning and found the forged entry, she was finished. A soft knock on the door jolted her. Emma's head snapped up just as Grace Holloway, her closest friend and fellow nurse, stepped inside. Her gaze flickered from Emma to Luke's unconscious form, then to the IV bag and the faint traces of water pooling on the floor from his drenched clothes. Emma's stomach dropped. She knew. Grace exhaled sharply, running a hand through her messy ponytail. Tell me you didn't. Emma's silence was answer enough. Grace closed her eyes for a second, then muttered a curse under her breath. Do you have any idea what they'll do if they find out? Yes, Emma said, her voice unwavering. And I don't care. Grace stared at her, torn between frustration and something else. Something dangerously close to admiration. Then, with a heavy sigh, she shook her head. Damn it, Emma. Emma braced herself for the lecture, but instead, Grace walked to the door and locked it. I didn't see anything, she said quietly. Relief crashed through Emma, but she knew this secret wouldn't stay buried forever. And when the truth finally came out, she would lose everything. Morning crept in through the hospital blinds, painting the sterile white walls with soft hues of gold. Emma had barely moved from her spot beside Luke's bed, her arms crossed, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. His fever had yet to break, but his breathing had steadied, his body no longer trembling violently. The IV drip delivered fluids and antibiotics into his veins, a slow but steady lifeline. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to him. A low groan escaped Luke's lips, his eyelids fluttering. Emma leaned forward, her pulse quickening. He stirred, his brows furrowing as he fought his way out of unconsciousness. His face was still pale, his lips dry and cracked, but his eyes, when they finally opened, were clearer than before. Hey, she said softly, relief flooding her voice. You're awake. Luke blinked sluggishly, confusion flickering across his face as he took in his surroundings. His gaze settled on the IV in his arm, the sterile hospital room, and finally on her. Where? His voice was barely more than a whisper, raw and weak. You're in St. James Hospital, Emma explained, keeping her voice calm. You had a severe infection. I brought you here last night. His brows knit together, and then realization dawned. His body tensed, his gaze sharpening despite the lingering haze of fever. You brought me here. His voice was hoarse, but there was something else beneath it. Some voice was hoarse, but there was something else beneath it. Emma nodded. You were burning up. I had to. He swallowed, his throat working against the dryness. Her jaw tightened. No, you didn't. A flicker of something. Pride, stubbornness, crossed his fevered eyes. He opened his mouth, but before he could say anything more, the door slammed open. Emma barely had time to react before Dr. Richard Collins strode into the room, his expression thunderous. Behind him, 2 senior hospital administrators followed, their eyes cold and unreadable. Her stomach dropped. Luke tensed beside her, sensing the sudden shift in the air. Nurse Sinclair, Dr. Collins' voice, was like ice, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room before locking onto her. Step outside. Now. Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The moment had come. She had known it would. Slowly, she rose to her feet. Luke watched her, his expression shifting from confusion to something else, something dangerously close to concern. Emma, he rasped, but she didn't look at him. She couldn't. Instead, she squared her shoulders and followed Dr. Collins into the hallway, her heartbeat a dull roar in her ears. The moment the door shut behind them, the head administrator, Margaret Holloway, crossed her arms. Do you deny falsifying hospital records to admit an undocumented patient? Emma's pulse pounded. There was no use lying. They already knew. No, she said, her voice even. A murmur rippled between them, but Dr. Collins' expression remained unreadable. You deliberately forged medical documents, Margaret continued, her voice tightening. You administered unauthorized treatment, occupied hospital resources without clearance, and ignored direct policies. Do you understand how serious these violations are? Emma lifted her chin. I understand that if I hadn't done those things, a man would have died on the street. Silence stretched between them. Dr. Collins exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. Your medical skills are commendable, Nurse Sinclair, but rules exist for a reason. You left us no choice. Her stomach twisted, but she had already accepted her fate. You're fired. The words landed like a blow, but Emma refused to let them break her. She had known this was coming the moment she'd carried Luke through those doors. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Fine. She turned, ready to walk away, but before she could, she glanced back at them, at their cold, detached faces. One day, she said, her voice quiet but firm, you'll realize that saving a life should matter more than hospital policies. And with that, she walked away. Her heart pounded as she made her way down the corridor, every step heavier than the last. She was jobless. Her career, everything she had worked for, was gone. But strangely, she didn't regret a single thing. The doors to Luke's room loomed ahead, and for a brief moment, she considered walking past them, leaving without a word. But something inside her twisted at the thought. She pushed the door open. Luke was sitting up now, still weak but alert. His head turned toward her, the second she stepped inside, his tired eyes narrowing in concern. What happened? His voice was rough, but there was an edge to it, something that told her he already knew the answer. Emma forced a small, humorless smile. I lost my job. For a long moment, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, his fingers clenched around the blanket draped over his lap. His jaw tightened. Because of me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement filled with something dark and bitter. Emma sighed, stepping closer. Because I broke the rules. I knew the risks. Luke's fists clenched tighter. You shouldn't have done that. She tilted her head, studying him. And let you die. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He looked away, his hands shaking slightly. "You don't even know me," he muttered. Emma exhaled, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. "I didn't need to." Something flickered across his face, something raw and unguarded. He swallowed hard, his shoulders sinking slightly. For the first time since she met him, Luke looked. A long silence stretched between them before he finally whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." Emma shook her head, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "You don't have to." She turned to leave, but just as her hand touched the door handle, his voice stopped her. Memma." She glanced over her shoulder. His eyes met hers, filled with something unspoken. "Thank you." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. And then she walked away, not knowing that this wasn't the end of their story, only the beginning. The cold air outside hit Emma like a slap as she stepped out of the hospital for the last time. The world hadn't changed, but for her, everything had. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her shoulders, but she forced herself to keep walking. She had no choice. She had just lost the career she had spent her entire adult life building. And for what? A man who had barely looked her in the eye before telling her she shouldn't have helped him. But she didn't regret it. She would never regret it. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets damp and glistening under the flickering streetlights. She walked aimlessly, the exhaustion in her bones sinking deeper with every step. The reality of what she had done, of what she had lost, was beginning to settle in. St. James had been her home, her purpose. And now she was nothing. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Grace. Emma hesitated before answering. "Hey," she said, her voice hoarse. "I just heard," Grace said. Her voice was tight, filled with something between anger and sorrow. "Emma, so sorry." Emma let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't be. I knew what I was doing." "You shouldn't have had to make that choice," Grace said fiercely. "It shouldn't be this way." Emma swallowed hard. "But it is." A long silence stretched between them. Then Grace sighed. "Look, my shift ends soon. Meet me at the diner." Emma wanted to say no. She wanted to crawl into bed and disappear from the world for a while. But what was the point? She had nowhere to be tomorrow, or the next day, or the next day, or the next. "Yeah," she murmured. "See you there." Luke sat on the edge of the hospital bed, staring blankly at the wall. The fever had broken, but the hollow ache in his chest had nothing to do with sickness. Emma was gone. And it was because of him. His fingers curled into fists against the thin hospital blanket. He hadn't asked for her help. He hadn't wanted her to throw away everything for him. And yet, she had, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. Why? Why would anyone do that? It had been years since he had met someone who did something without an agenda. Since someone had looked at him and seen something worth saving. His mind drifted back to the life he had lost. Luke Donovan, co-founder of Xenith Innovations. Once, his name had meant something. Once he had walked into boardrooms and commanded respect. Once he had built something from nothing. And then he had lost it all. Betrayed by the man he trusted most. Victor Langley. The name still burned like acid on his tongue. Victor had been his business partner, his friend. They had built Xenith from the ground up, turning it into one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the industry. Investors had poured money into their vision, and for a while, it had seemed unstoppable. Until the fraud scandal. Until the missing millions. Until the lawsuits. By the time Luke had realized what was happening, it had been too late. Victor had already covered his tracks, already shifted the blame. The courts had frozen Luke's assets. The press had painted him as the reckless partner, the one who had let greed blind him. He had lost everything. His company, his fortune, his reputation, and, worst of all, his faith in people. The downward spiral had been fast, too fast. The luxury apartment, gone. The savings, gone. His so-called friends, they had disappeared the moment he became a liability. Months turned into years, and before he knew it, Luke Donovan, former CEO, the man who had once stood at the top, had become a ghost, a nobody. And now, for the first time in a long time, someone had seen him, had fought for him, and he had let her walk away. His jaw clenched. No, not this time. He had spent too long accepting defeat, too long letting life happen to him. It was time to fight back. And the first step? Finding Emma. Emma stared at the untouched coffee in front of her, her fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. Across the diner table, Grace watched her with quiet concern. "So, what now?" Grace finally asked. Emma let out a slow breath. "I have no idea." Grace pursed her lips. "You could fight this, you know. Appeal the decision. Make them see that you were right." Emma shook her head. "They don't care about right or wrong. They care about policies." "Then screw them," Grace said. "You're a damn good nurse, Emma. Someone else will hire you." Emma bit the inside of her cheek. "I've already sent out applications. Every major hospital in the city has turned me down." Grace's expression darkened because of what happened. Emma nodded. Then, Grace hesitated. "What about leaving London? A fresh start?" Emma looked away. "I can't just pick up and start over. This is my home." Grace exhaled, rubbing her forehead. "Then you have to figure out another way, Emma. You can't just let them take everything from you." Emma swallowed hard. She didn't know how to rebuild. She didn't even know where to start. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely and utterly lost. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that somewhere across the city, Luke Donovan had just made a decision. One that would change everything. Luke stood at the entrance of the homeless shelter, the damp scent of old wood and cheap disinfectant filling his lungs. The place was a far cry from the penthouses and luxury boardrooms he had once known, but he had spent enough nights here to feel the ghosts of his past clinging to the walls. He had nothing left here, just a battered duffel bag stuffed with a few pieces of secondhand clothing and the weight of regrets that refused to fade. But tonight, for the first time in years, there was something else inside him. A flicker of something he had lost long ago. Purpose. He clenched his jaw, gripping the paper in his hands. It was Elliot Hayes' business card. Luke had barely recognized the man when they had run into each other earlier that afternoon. Elliot had been a rising star at Syntech, a few levels below him, but sharp. Someone Luke had respected. Back then, he had seen potential in Elliot, had even mentored him a little before everything had gone to hell. And today, standing outside a coffee shop, Elliot had seen him. "Jesus Christ, Luke," he had muttered. His expression caught between shock and something dangerously close to pity. "I thought you were dead." Luke had wanted to disappear. The last thing he needed was someone from his past looking at him like that. But Elliot hadn't walked away. He had offered him a job. Not charity, a real job. "It's not glamorous," Elliot had admitted, slipping him the card. "Small tech firm, barely keeping its head above water. But it's something. And it's better than..." Luke had stared at the card for a long time after Elliot left, his mind a battlefield of doubt and shame. But now, standing outside the shelter, he made a choice. He was done waiting for life to change. It was time to take it back. The next morning, Luke stood outside the glass, and, steel headquarters of Innovatech Solutions, his pulse a steady drumbeat against his ribs. The company wasn't much. Third tier in the industry, struggling to stay relevant in a market dominated by giants. But to Luke, it might as well have been a lifeline. He adjusted the collar of his borrowed button-up shirt. It didn't fit quite right, too loose in the shoulders, too tight at the wrists, but it was the best he had. The receptionist barely spared him a glance as she directed him to the third floor. Elliot was already waiting in a small, windowless office, leaning against a cluttered desk. "You came," he said, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Wasn't sure if you would." Luke shrugged, figured it was worth a shot. Elliot nodded, then gestured to a chair. "Let's get one thing straight. I'm not handing you anything. You start at the bottom, like everyone else. Entry-level data analysis. No special treatment. No shortcuts. You screw up, you're out." Luke met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Something flickered in Elliot's eyes. Approval, maybe. Good. "Then let's see if you still remember how to work." The first few weeks were brutal. Luke had spent years being the boss, the decision-maker, the one calling the shots. Now, he was drowning in spreadsheets, buried under endless reports, treated like just another faceless employee in a company that didn't know or care who he used to be. And he welcomed it. He worked late, taking on projects no one else wanted. He listened, learned, adapted, and slowly he started to remember the thrill of solving complex problems, the satisfaction of making something work, the fire in his gut that had once driven him to build an empire. It had never been about the money. It had been about creating something bigger than himself. And for the first time in years, he felt that fire again. But even as he rebuilt his career, one thought refused to leave him. Emma. Emma. She had risked everything for him, and now she was struggling because of it. Every time he thought about it, rage burned in his chest. She deserved better. And he was going to make sure she got it. No matter what it took. The low hum of fluorescent lights filled the cramped office space as Luke sifted through another endless stack of data reports. The numbers blurred together, but he pushed through, his fingers flying over the keyboard. It had been months since he started at Innovatech Solutions, and while the work was monotonous, he had proven himself. He had clawed his way back from the bottom, taking on extra projects, solving problems no one else could, and gradually earning the respect of his colleagues. But he wasn't satisfied. Because Emma Sinclair was still out there, struggling because of him. And that was something he couldn't accept. He had tried to push her out of his mind, had told himself that what happened between them was just a moment in time, an act of kindness from someone who didn't owe him anything. But it wasn't that simple. She had changed everything. And the more he rebuilt his life, the more he realized that he owed her more than just gratitude. He owed her justice. That night, after his shift ended, Luke pulled out a scrap of paper from his wallet. A business card with nothing but a name and a number scrawled across it in fading ink. Harrison Blackwell, private investigator. He hesitated for only a second before dialing. "Blackwell Investigations," a deep voice answered. Luke took a breath. "I need you to find someone." Emma stood in front of the tiny, overcrowded clinic, exhaustion pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. The air inside was thick with the scent of antiseptic and sweat, the waiting room packed with patients who couldn't afford private health care. This wasn't where she was supposed to be. She had spent years training in state of the art hospitals, working in emergency rooms with the best equipment and top-tier specialists. But after St. James blacklisted her, she had been left with nowhere to go. No hospital in London wanted a nurse who had defied protocol no matter how good she was. So she had ended up here, in a clinic that was constantly underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed. And the worst part, she loved the work. Every day, she fought for patients who had been abandoned by the system. She made do with limited supplies, found ways to treat people who had no insurance, pushed herself to keep going even when she felt like collapsing. But she was barely scraping by. The salary was laughable, just enough to cover rent and keep food in her fridge. And the weight of what had happened at St. James still followed her like a shadow. She had lost everything for doing the right thing. And some nights, she wondered if it had even mattered. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Dr. Patel, the head of the clinic, peering in. "We're out of antibiotics again," he said, rubbing a hand over his weary face. "And the supplier won't extend our credit." Emma gritted her teeth. This was the third time this month. "I'll figure something out," she said, already thinking of how many patients would go untreated if she didn't. Dr. Patel sighed. "You always do." And that was the problem. She was always finding a way to make things work. But who was fighting for her? Luke stared at the manila folder on his desk, his jaw tightening as he flipped through the pages. Blackwell had delivered. Inside were the details of Emma's life after she was fired, where she worked, where she lived, the struggles she faced. And it was worse than he had imagined. She was working in a clinic barely holding itself together, blacklisted from every major hospital. She was barely making enough to get by, but still fighting for people who had nowhere else to turn. And that was when the anger set in. She had risked everything for him, and the world had punched her for it. He closed the folder, his grip tightening. He had fought his way back. He had power again, resources, influence. And he was going to use every bit of it to fix this. Emma's shift had just ended when she stepped out of the clinic, the cool night air washing over her. She was too tired to think, too drained to care about anything other than getting home and collapsing into bed. And then she saw him. Luke stood across the street, leaning against the hood of a sleek black car, hands tucked into the pockets of his expensive coat. For a second, she thought she was imagining him. He wasn't supposed to be here. The last time she had seen him, he had been weak, feverish, barely holding on. And now he looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not outside a rundown clinic. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She took a step forward. "Luke?" His eyes met hers, steady, unwavering. "It's been a while," he said. She swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" A pause. A pause. And then, softly, but with absolute certainty, "Fixing what I broke." Emma stared at him, the cold night air suddenly feeling suffocating. She had imagined seeing Luke again, but never like this, never standing in front of her in a tailored coat, looking every bit like the powerful man he must have been before life chewed him up and spat him out. She had spent months wondering if he was okay, if he had made it. And now he was here, whole and strong. But the words he had just spoken, "fixing what I broke," didn't sit right. She crossed her arms, schooling her expression. "You didn't break anything, Luke." His gaze flickered, something unreadable in those sharp blue eyes. "You lost everything because of me." Emma exhaled, shaking her head. "I made a choice." "And I made one too," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm making another one now." She wanted to ask what that meant, but before she could, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, giving Luke a small nod before holding the door open. Luke gestured toward the car. "Come with me." Emma frowned. Luke. Please. His voice was softer now. Just trust me. And that was the problem. She did trust him. With a wary glance at the clinic behind her, she sighed and slid into the car. The drive was silent. Emma kept her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing. Where had he been? How had he managed to turn his life around so quickly? When the car finally pulled up in front of a massive glass skyscraper, her breath caught. She turned to Luke. Where are we? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened his door and stepped out. Emma followed, her eyes sweeping over the sleek exterior of the building, the glowing logo near the top. Reynolds Donovan. Reynolds Donovan? Donovan. Her stomach twisted. Luke met her gaze, something steady and determined in his stance. Come inside. The elevator ride to the top floor was quiet, except for the soft hum of classical music playing overhead. Emma stole glances at Luke, but his face gave nothing away. When the door slid open, she stepped into a stunning office space. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the London skyline, minimalist furniture, and a massive desk at the center. But what stopped her cold was the nameplate on the desk. Luke Donovan. T.O. Her heart pounded. You're running this place, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Yes. Emma swallowed. This didn't make sense. The last time she had seen him, he had been barely surviving. Now he was running one of the most influential tech firms in the city? How? She whispered. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. It wasn't easy, but I clawed my way back. I had to. His gaze darkened, and every step of the way, I kept thinking about you, about what you lost because of me. Emma shook her head. I told you, Luke, you don't owe me anything. His jaw tightened. That's not what this is about. Then what is this about? He took a breath, then stepped closer. Too close. I want to give you a hospital, he said. Emma blinked. What? A hospital, he repeated, his voice unwavering. Your hospital? She shook her head, stepping back. Luke, that's insane. You can't just... I can, he interrupted, his voice firm. I have the resources, the connections, the funding. And I know you, Emma. I know that clinic is barely hanging on. I know you're treating patients with supplies that should have been restocked months ago. And I know that you're too damn stubborn to ask for help. Her breath caught. This isn't charity, he said. Softer this time. This is giving you back what was taken from you. She pressed her fingers against her temple, trying to process what he was saying. A hospital. Her own hospital. It was impossible. It was insane. And yet, it was everything she had ever dreamed of. She glanced at him, at the determination in his eyes. And for the first time in months, hope stirred in her chest. Emma paced the length of Luke's office, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The words still hung in the air between them, too heavy, too impossible to grasp. Hospital. Her own hospital. She turned to face him, heart pounding. Luke, this isn't. She stopped herself, exhaling sharply. This isn't realistic. Luke's expression didn't waver. Why not? She let out a disbelieving laugh. Because you don't just hand someone a hospital. It's not a gift, like a damn fruit basket. It's an entire institution. Staff funding, regulations. She shook her head. It's too much. It's exactly what you deserve, he countered, his voice calm but unyielding. Emma clenched her jaw. This isn't about what I deserve." Luke took a slow step closer, his gaze locked on hers. "Then tell me what this is about." She swallowed, forcing herself to hold his stare, because she knew what this was about. It was about the fact that she had spent months trying to move on, trying to build something from nothing, to keep pushing forward without looking back. It was about the fact that she had learned to live with her losses, to accept them as the cost of doing what was right. And now he was standing here, offering to undo it all with a single stroke. She should have been grateful, but all she felt was terrified. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. Luke's brow furrowed. "What?" "This." She gestured around them, frustration creeping to her voice. "Why are you doing this? Is this about guilt? About making things even?" Luke's jaw tightened. "You really think that?" Emma let out a breath, shaking her head. "I don't know." Silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. Then Luke exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, not physically, but in a way that told her this wasn't some spur of the moment decision. "I'm doing this," he said finally, "because the world is full of people who do nothing when they see something broken. And you did something, even when it cost you everything." His voice softened. "You saved my life, Emma. And I know you didn't do it expecting anything in return. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stand by and let you suffer for it." She closed her eyes for a second, fighting against the tightness in her chest. "I don't want charity," she whispered. "And I'm not offering charity," Luke said firmly. "I'm offering a partnership." Emma's eyes snapped open. Luke stepped forward, lowering his voice. "This hospital, it won't be mine. It'll be yours. But I'll fund it, I'll handle the business, the bureaucracy, the politics." A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You always hated all that anyway." Despite herself, a reluctant laugh escaped her. "I did." He nodded. "You take care of what matters. Your patients. I take care of the rest. No strings attached." Emma's pulse pounded in her ears. No strings attached. No debts. No expectations. Just a chance. She let out a slow breath. She wanted this, more than anything. And maybe, just maybe, she deserved to say yes. So she did. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of motion. Meetings, negotiations, site visits, endless paperwork. Emma had always thought that building a hospital would take years, maybe even decades, but with Luke at the helm, things moved fast. Too fast. It was overwhelming. She sat across from Luke in the conference room of a high-rise overlooking the Thames, stacks of documents spread out between them. Architects, legal teams, and financial advisors had been in and out all day, discussing permits, equipment, staffing. Things she had never imagined would be her responsibility. And yet, here she was. Luke, as always, was composed, in control, handling each question with practiced ease. Watching him like this, commanding, confident, stepping into the power he had once lost, was like watching someone who had never fallen at all. Emma, on the other hand, felt like she was barely keeping her head above water. "This is insane," she muttered under her breath, staring at the proposed floor plan in front of her. "How is this actually happening?" Luke glanced up from his laptop. "Because you said yes." She exhaled. "That's what I'm afraid of." A flicker of something crossed his expression. Concern, maybe, or amusement. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Talk to me, Emma." She looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time since this whole thing started, she let herself say the truth. What if I'm not ready for this? She admitted. Luke tilted his head slightly.
Not ready for what?
All of it. She gestured vaguely to the mess of documents between them. This hospital. The responsibility. The expectation that I can pull this off. She swallowed hard. What if I fail? Luke was quiet for a moment, then he leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. His voice was calm, steady, certain. You won't. She let out a breathless laugh. You sound awfully sure of that. Because I am. He held her gaze, unwavering. You didn't hesitate to fight for me, Emma. Not once. Even when you knew what it would cost you. And I know you. When you fight for something, you don't lose. Emma swallowed past the lump in her throat. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in herself. Luke sat back, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. Besides, if you do fail, we'll just fix it. That's how this works. She raised an eyebrow.
We.
His expression didn't waver. Yeah, we. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Something shifting in her chest. Something dangerous. Something terrifying. Something that felt like hope. She had spent months feeling alone. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't anymore. The hospital was beginning to take shape. On paper, in contracts, in negotiations. But for Emma, it still felt like a dream. A fragile, impossible dream that could vanish the moment she allowed herself to believe in it too much. She poured herself into the work, burying herself in blueprints, staffing plans, patient care models, anything that would keep her from thinking about the other thing. The thing she refused to acknowledge. Luke. He was everywhere. Not just in the meetings, not just in the way his influence had made this whole thing possible, but in the way he had become a constant in her life. The late-night strategy sessions, the shared cups of coffee in the early hours of the morning. The moments when she'd catch him watching her, something unreadable in his gaze. She had spent so long keeping her walls up, and yet he was slipping through the cracks. And that terrified her, because she wasn't sure if he was here because of her or because of what she had done for him. One evening, after a particularly exhausting meeting, she found herself sitting across from him in the dimly lit office of their temporary headquarters. The city lights flickered outside the window, casting shadows across his face as he skimmed over some last-minute contracts. "You're staring," he murmured without looking up. Emma blinked, heat rushing to her cheeks. "I'm not." His lips twitched. "You are."
She exhaled, rubbing her temples. It's just, you're really doing this.
Luke finally set down the papers, his gaze locking onto hers. "So are you." She hesitated. She wanted to ask, wanted to finally voice the question that had been gnawing at her for weeks. "Why are you really here, Luke?" But she couldn't. Because if the answer wasn't what she wanted to hear, she wasn't sure she could handle it. So instead, she forced a small, tired smile and leaned back in her chair.
You know that, right?
Luke smirked.
Oh, absolutely.
And for a moment, it was enough. Emma stood in the middle of the unfinished hospital lobby, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings thick in the air. Construction workers moved around her, voices echoing as they installed fixtures, wired monitors, and assembled furniture. It was all finally real. For months, she had drowned in blueprints, contracts, and bureaucratic nightmares. Now, standing in the space that would soon be filled with patients, nurses, and doctors who wouldn't have to turn anyone away, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Hope. A deep voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Looks good, doesn't it?" She turned to see Luke leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. She let out a breath. shaking her head. It's terrifying. Luke raised an eyebrow. Terrifying. Emma gestured around. It's happening. I don't get to just plan and dream anymore. In a few weeks, we open the doors. And if I fail, it won't just be me who loses. It'll be every patient who walks in here, hoping we can help. Luke studied her for a long moment before stepping forward, his voice quieter now. She let out a breathless laugh. You keep saying that. Because it's true. He tilted his head, searching her face. Why are you really scared, Emma? She opened her mouth to argue, to brush it off. But the way he was looking at her, like he saw through every excuse she could possibly make, made her stomach twist. She shook her head. Because what if I can't handle it? What if this whole thing? She gestured at the hospital, at everything. It's too big for me. Luke took another step closer. Then you lean on me. Her breath caught. And there it was. That dangerous unspoken thing between them that had been lingering for months. The thing she had tried to ignore, tried to pretend wasn't creeping into every late-night meeting, every shared glance. Because the truth was, Luke wasn't just here because of the hospital. He was here because of her. And she was terrified to believe that. Because what if this wasn't real? What if it was just debt, gratitude, obligation disguised as something else? She looked away. I need to get back to work. Luke studied her for a moment, then nodded, stepping back. All right? But as he turned to leave, his voice was softer. I hope one day you stop running from this. And when he walked away, Emma wasn't sure if he meant the hospital or him. The hospital opened on a crisp spring morning. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, reflecting off the polished floors, casting a warm glow over the waiting area that, for the first time, wasn't empty. Patients filled the seats, nurses moved with purpose, and a quiet hum of life settled into the walls of the place Emma had built. She had spent so long doubting herself, fearing she wasn't ready, that she would fail. But now, standing in the center of it all, watching doctors consult with patients, hearing the steady beep of monitors in the rooms beyond, she finally believed it was real. She had done it. And yet, as she turned to walk through the halls, she knew there was still one thing left unfinished. Luke. They had spent the past few months dancing around each other, both pretending that the weight between them didn't exist. That whatever was growing in the spaces between late-night conversations and quiet glances wasn't real. But it was. And she was done running from it. That night, she found herself standing outside his office. He was sitting at his desk, deep in thought, one hand absently rubbing his temple the way he always did when he was overworked. She knocked lightly. He looked up, startled. Emma? She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. I've been afraid, she admitted. Luke sat back, giving her his full attention.
Of what?
She exhaled. That what we have is just tied to what happened before. That maybe you're here because of what I did, not because of who I am. A flicker of understanding crossed his face. And now, he asked softly. She took a breath, stepped closer. Now I know that's not true. His breath hitched slightly, but he didn't move. He was still waiting, always waiting for her to decide. So this time, she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and kissed him. And just like that, the last of her fears melted away. Months passed, and the hospital flourished. It became a place of refuge, of hope, a place where no one was turned away. But more than that, Emma and Luke built something together. Late nights turned into early mornings. Boardroom meetings turned into quiet moments over coffee. And somewhere between the laughter, the fights, the endless challenges of running something this big, they became more than partners. They became home. It happened on an ordinary evening. No grand gestures, no extravagant setting. Just the two of them on the hospital rooftop, overlooking the city they had both fought to call home again. Luke reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box. And when he turned to her, his voice was steady, certain. "Marry me, Emma." Her heart clenched. Years ago, she had found him in rain, lost and broken. Now he stood before her, whole and strong. Not as a man seeking salvation, but as a man who simply wanted her. No conditions, no debts, just love. A slow smile spread across her lips. Yes. Luke exhaled softly, as if he had been holding that breath for years. And when he slid the ring onto her finger, she knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. A lesson in redemption, kindness, and love. At its core, this story is about how a single act of kindness can change not just one life, but many. Emma had no reason to risk everything for Luke. She didn't know his past, didn't owe him anything, but she saw a man in need and chose to help, even when it cost her everything. That single moment set off a chain reaction, leading them both to redemption, purpose, and love. Life often presents us with choices: to walk away or to step forward to protect ourselves, or to risk something for the sake of another. Emma's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest rewards come from the hardest decisions. She lost her job, her security, and her reputation, but in the end, she gained something far greater, a purpose that was truly her own. Luke's journey, on the other hand, shows that failure does not define us. What we do after does. He could have let his downfall consume him, but instead, he fought his way back. And in the process, he realized that success meant nothing without using it to uplift others. Love at its purest is not about debt or obligation. It's not about evening the scales. It's about choosing someone over and over again, not because you have to, but because you want to. So, if there's one lesson to take away, it's this: kindness has power. Second chances exist, and sometimes the life you save might just change your own. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We have more heartwarming tales coming soon. See you in the next one.